And I'll give you a really short version of their biographies. You have a much longer version in the program because we could probably eat up much of the time available to us if we went through all of their accomplishments and distinctions. We have in alphabetical order Mr. Peter Bowe. Mr. Bowe is president of Ellicott Dredge Enterprises, a holding company for Ellicott Dredges and liquid waste technology. He received his bachelor's magna cum laude from Yale College and his MBA with distinction from Harvard University, and publishes op-ed pieces in the Wall Street Journal and the Baltimore Sun and elsewhere. One thing from the long list that I thought might be interesting to mention is that in 2006, Ellicott Dredges received the U.S. Commerce Department's Export Achievement Award, which was presented by Senator Ben Cardin. And in 2007, Fortune magazine wrote a feature story on how Ellicott is a leading example among American manufacturers succeeding worldwide with competitive products. Ms. Ganz is the Chief Executive Officer and Principal Shareholder of Lion Brothers Company, which was founded in 1899. Lion is the leading designer and manufacturer of apparel and affinity brand identification and insignia. Ms. Ganz holds an MBA in Finance and Multinational Management from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and before that did her bachelor's in economics from the University of Florida. Ms. Ganz has been selected as top 100 women in Maryland multiple times, inducted into the Circle of Excellence, and top 100 minority business enterprises. She has received numerous awards and recognitions for her leadership and commitment to innovation, economic development, and sustainability. And our third panelist, Mr. William Hutton, he's President, Chief Operating, and Chief Financial Officer of Titan Steel Corporation. And he also mentioned in the phone conversation that he has a very hands-on role in his company in all of these roles. Titan Steel Corporation has steel processing facilities in North America, as well as offices overseas in Sao Paulo, Madrid, Dubai, and Ningbo. Mr. Hutton graduated from Williams College in 1979 with a bachelor's in political economy. He received a joint MBA, MA degree in 1983 from Yale University. Mr. Hutton is a 2010 winner of the Maryland International Business Leadership Award. So please welcome our distinguished panelists. So I thought I would start by asking each of our panelists to introduce their companies themselves, and then we'll start and explore a range of questions. Let's start with Mr. Bowe.
Yeah, Ellicott's based in Baltimore. The name Ellicott comes from Ellicott City, the family that founded it back in 1885. We make dredging equipment. We're a manufacturer, not a contractor. Most people may think of dredges as used for transportation. The largest use is actually for mining sand, gold, copper, tin, phosphate, things like that. So we're very much driven by infrastructure investments, and that's really where we go. We follow emerging markets. We're the largest investors in infrastructure. We have a couple hundred employees, a plant in Wisconsin besides Baltimore. We recently bought a business in Germany, which is a big step for us because until now we've been 100% US based. We sell to about 20 countries a year. Larger markets would be places like Iraq, Mexico, India, Bangladesh, crazy places.
Thank you. Lion Brothers started out in 1899 as an embroidery company, one of the first in the United States, and today it is a designer and manufacturer for, I don't know how many of you were Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts growing up, but they're still clients of Lion's. In addition to global brands, federal government, sports market, so when you see a Washington team playing, chances are it has our identification on the apparel. And today we focus on designing all over the world, and we distribute to factory partners throughout the world.
Fine. Titan, as Kislaya said, we're a steel company. Our emphasis is tin plate steel, the kind of steel that's used for metal packaging. Also, we specialize in steel plate, heavy steel plate, for pressure vessel and oil and gas industry applications. We employ just over 100 people, 3 facilities in North America, plus the overseas offices in Brazil, Madrid, Sao Paulo, and Ningbo, China. Last year, sales were about 110 million. We sold our product in 39 different countries around the world, throughout Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Central and South America. Now, our supply source, in other words, where we obtain our steel from that we process and sell, our supply source is predominantly North American. We're actually a very substantial net exporter of steel from the United States, which is rather unusual. But we also count as regular suppliers steel mills around the world: Korea, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, Ukraine, Brazil, Germany, Italy, and I'm probably missing a few. So it's not only on the sales side, but it's also on the supply side that we play in the global arena.
So here's the plan that I thought of, but I'll want to leave plenty of time for questions, is that we would start by getting your sense as business leaders, your perspective on the kind of thing that Dr. Blank was speaking about, this. From where you sit, do you see the same kind of the emergence or rise of India, China for your companies? Is their presence palpable, or is there just this excessive euphoria of emerging markets right now? Let's start with Mr. Hutton.
For us in the steel industry in general, and certainly for our products in particular, the last 20 years has seen a complete revolution in global patterns of steel demand and steel supply. Just to take China for an example, in 1990, for our company, China was actually a very, very large market for us to sell into. We were a substantial exporter of steel from North America and from other places to China. Over the last several years, that trading position has completely flipped. China went from being a huge net importer of steel to being one of the world's largest exporters of steel. They now produce about 50% of the steel that's produced in the world. We no longer sell hardly any steel in China. We've, in fact, switched our position. We opened an office in China, and we are now purchasing steel from China for export from China.
Ms. Ganz, I'll put it another way. When we spoke on the phone, you said you have teams in many countries this very week. And as I was wondering, what exactly are they doing, and how that ties in with our general question? Yes.
It ties in directly with regard to your comments about China. So we've had a facility in China for about 25 years. We employ about 800 people over there, manufacturing products traditionally for export to the United States, to Europe, and other first world countries. However, today, our infrastructure in China it's shifting for 2 reasons. One is obviously to be able to make goods for the local market in China. But the second reason is because as labor wage rates rise, as we continue, the beginnings of inflation in China, if you will, between revaluation of the local currency and escalating cost, we have to look at it in terms of portfolio management, risk management with regard to how we're going to operate in the future. So as we're doing that, we're looking at other countries, other emerging markets that create other sorts of value, time value, distance value, and ultimately, what should a portfolio of the future look like? Our teams are engaged in those activities presently.
So the BRICS certainly are markets we all should be thinking about, but we have to remember that there's not necessarily anything connecting them to each other than their high growth rates. They're all very different, one from the other. For us, each of those countries, we're doing business there, but they all represent different sets of risks and opportunities. For example, in India, there's no infrastructure and transportation to speak of, so we're very active there, and there's not much in the way of indigenous supplier capacity. China is arguably the biggest dredges market in the world for dredges, but we're not there because we think that the intellectual property environment is so damaging that it will, any gains that we can get from the market will likely bite us in the tail. Our Dutch competitor has a different strategy. They're there in sort of multiple ways. They're bigger than we are, and we're actually steering clear of China. So which so far I'm happy with. Russia is a market for us in oil sludge cleanup in the Siberian area. I'm glad it's a small market, because if it was big, I'd be worried about Mr. Putin putting his hands in my pocket, and it's scary places. You think about that. No, the Commerce Secretary didn't talk about agencies like OPIC, which provides political risk insurance, but it's an agency that we use in some of our activities overseas. And all those countries have from time to time engaged in import substitution policies, overt and covert methods to keep imports out, meaning American exports out. And it's an ongoing policy challenge for the U.S. to try to break those barriers down.
So, well, Mr. Bowe mentioned intellectual property protection. Well, what are some of the other sort of unique difficulties you see in emerging markets as you work there? Either of you?
Talk about intellectual property more.
The intellectual property is an interesting discussion, both in the United States as well as overseas. I know that we have patents that have been in the patent office since 2006 that have yet to be fully reviewed. And in an age of high innovation and high invention, I'm not sure whether, in terms of protection, certainly we have issues overseas, but they are also looking at us to see what we're going to do from a United States standpoint. And unless we understand that the rate of invention is exponential and has very little to do with the rate of invention in the past, then I know we are in the process of rethinking how we're going to protect our own intellectual property. But I think that it probably starts in our relationship here in the United States as much as it relates to the protection overseas. So it's an interesting time to be looking at this on not only an international basis, but also a domestic basis.
Talk about rate of invention. So a dredge is a piece of construction equipment, costs, let's say, $1 million. Ideally, you can minimize the engineering cost per unit, and to the extent that the development cycle gets shortened or the life cycle gets shortened, that's very harmful to our industry. You'd like it to be longer. One of the most common aspects of intellectual property that drives me crazy in China is I can look on the internet this morning, and see where Chinese players, whether they're manufacturers or traders, rip off website pictures from our website or our competitors and hold themselves out and say, this is what we can offer. So then there's third-party customers, let's say they're in Nigeria or Ghana, say, oh, that's just what I want. Well, it's not what it may be what they want, but it's not what they're going to get. So that beyond the technical backup, then it confuses the discussion.
There's another dimension related to intellectual property. Another dimension about emerging markets that sometimes makes it challenging, particularly for small, medium-sized U.S. companies, is that the political and the economic regulations are still somewhat in flux. Good example again, and this isn't China bashing here, but we're all looking at it as a market. Our company, we took a hard look at establishing a wholly owned foreign enterprise in China earlier this year, and basically after quite a bit of research, given the small opportunity for us in that market domestically, decided against that initiative simply because we weren't confident that with respect to the steel industry, for which the Chinese government has a particular strategic interest, that the rules of the game had stabilized sufficiently that we could be confident that over a 5-10 year period, we weren't going to perhaps have some unpleasant surprises if we deepened our commitment there.
So that was, well, about, in some sense, intellectual property, about unfair competition in these countries. And I think Dr. Blank also, we were talking earlier about it, talked about how 2 of her papers have been published in Chinese under different author names that are different from hers. But within the scope of fair competition, what kind of, do you have competitors from emerging markets, and is it mostly fair or government subsidized, from their governments, government subsidized competition? How do you see your competitors from these regions?
Well, in our business, it depends completely. In our business, your 3 of the 4 bricks have been huge growing factors in the world industry: China, India, and Brazil. And all three have been a little bit different. China, the industry there is a mix of directly state or province-owned companies, which can, in certain cases, get quite a bit of state support. And then you have some very successful private firms. India, the model, the most successful international firms generally have been exclusively privately owned, and they've been more aggressive about making foreign direct investments overseas. I mean, the largest steel company in the world, of course, ArcelorMittal, is Indian-owned. Tata Industries is a huge force in the global steel market, as is Essar, and that's just to name three of them. And they've been very aggressive, not only in developing their internal markets, but actually making foreign direct investment abroad. In Brazil, again, mostly private companies, but if you follow what's been going on in Brazil recently, still they get some extra attention, shall we say, from the government in terms of their strategic importance.
And in terms of our sector, traditionally there have been significant companies in terms of the manufacture of apparel and textile products. However, when you also take into consideration that 24.5% of the goods produced in China in the sector are exported, and the remainder remain in country, it's really quite a figure to put your arms around. And the denationalization, if you will, of the sector continues.
I think we've sold to, let's say, 20 countries in a year. We sold to 50 in the last decade. There are 200 countries. I think of that means there's 150 countries where we haven't yet made a mistake. That's yet. That means we will make a mistake, and you stumble forward as you go through and learn these rules. What I think of a bill trying to decide not to set up a company in China because of the lack of certainty in that. There's so many different rules in every country. It's rather daunting. If you're trying to sell to India and it's a governmental buyer and they know who they want, they'll look at who the supplier base is and they'll set up the rules for a tender that are nominally transparent but actually set up to exclude people. They'll say, okay, you have to have been in business for 15 years if they know there's a supplier that is 13 years that they don't want. That kind of thing. In Brazil, we recently, talking about government now, government buyers, we recently lost a port award where they actually had a Dutch auction, which I hate. That means they go around and say, okay, well, you bid 100, you bid 99, you bid 98. That's a weird way to bid it in a bid. And then we won the auction, and then they canceled the tender. Say, well, budget shortfall, which may in fact be the case. Certainly if you're selling to the private sector, that's a different set of rules. So it's hard to generalize these things. You just have to have your eyes open. And when you get into a new market, be very, meet with the U.S. government. The Commerce Department actually has a wonderful program. The Secretary didn't talk about, the Foreign Commercial Service, to help people learn these issues in advance, to minimize the mistakes.
So our students always like to get a sense from what is the frame leaders of companies use to think about particular problems. So, for instance, entry into a particular country. You were just talking about the 100 countries that you're not in. How do you decide whether the 50 that you have are enough or whether you need to go into more countries? And what are the kinds of things that you consider in trying to make that decision?
I'll start.
Start with.
I mean, what the Secretary said about looking at the growth rates, the GDP growth rates, is spot on. We do that. We say, okay, who is growing, who's not growing? Because if you're selling infrastructure, the growing countries are the ones that are going to invest in infrastructure. So I mean, we look at those, the economist forecast or the Commerce Department forecast, and say, that's where we need to be.
And for us, it really has to do with purpose. It has to do with whether the purpose is production or the purpose is really looking at the local market and suggesting this is an attractive local market for consumer purposes.
So now, you are actually looking at different. So this production, how much of it is taking place overseas for your company?
Sure. Today, 80% is overseas. However, our objective is to bring it back.
Okay, and in what countries? So many different countries, or
no, just several countries. So as we look at today, we produce in generally China and the United States. We subcontract into Central America and Canada. However, we look at balancing our portfolio. We've increased capacity about 50% over the past year as we grow. We'll rebalance. Instead of adding additional capacities in China, we'll begin to rebalance in Central America. But our ultimate goal is to bring back manufacturing to the United States and to then look at a model in country, for country.
For us, like Peter, we'll start at a very high level, macro level, and look at where, which economies are doing well. Many of the countries listed, that the speaker listed, have growing middle classes, a growing need for metal packaging, particularly for foodstuff, but also for paint and a variety of other household products. Those will be attractive markets for us. The other thing we take into account very early in an evaluation process is a very practical consideration: how will we get paid for our product? And payment terms, when you're talking about emerging markets, I mean, we could all spend the rest of the morning talking about that, but there are constantly shifting sands. We have to protect ourselves, but we have to be competitive as well.
So let me take us in a slightly different direction, and this one goes to the title of the conference itself. I want to bring you to this theme of where you think we are as a country right now. I look at news items and say that say 60% of the people think we're headed in the wrong direction, or people think of prospects for incomes for themselves and their children. And so I was wondering where you think we are as a country, and your sense on, are we following the right policies? So get a bit away from your companies and to the country. Mr. Hutton.
Well, let's see. The short answer is yes, I think our country is heading in the right direction, in that I think that, as opposed to maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I think generally speaking in our country there's a greater realization that many of the challenges we face are challenges that we need to face ourselves, rather than attributing our difficulties perhaps to trading partners overseas. To go back to the first speaker, she mentioned that many of the changes we've seen in the economic landscape have had more to do with technological change than they have with actual trading impacts, and I would tend to agree with that. So in a variety of areas, I'm encouraged by the fact that we recognize, for example, our education system, particularly at the elementary and secondary level, and that's the heart and soul concern of my company, because that's where we draw the majority of our workforce. Our education system isn't up to snuff compared to our competitors. There was mention of infrastructure earlier. That's of terrific importance to us, and all these things. And the fact that we're honest about our problems, I think is a very encouraging sign. The challenges are substantial.
I think we're
the same question. Yes.
Sure. I think we're at a real inflection point. This is a very interesting time. The rest of the world is moving at breathtaking speed, and we're stuck in conversations about what we should do. And we're in a country that believes in democracy, of these dialogues and discussions. However, these dialogues and discussions are taking time. And there's a tremendous lack of focus in terms of what we need to do. We say the words innovation and education and infrastructure, yet our focus in terms of innovation compared with other countries is slow. Our understanding of mobility and the mobility offered in other countries is unrealistic. While we have countries that are moving at a very rapid speed and want to own markets and want to innovate, commercialize, and bring things at a very fast rate, we are in the midst of dialogue about these issues and wondering how should we, whether it's not a choice whether we should, it's how can we and how rapidly can we. And when you take countries such as Israel and others such as China, much of our, interestingly, in our own industry, I give you the metaphor that traditionally innovation came from first world countries, then were transitioned to third world countries. Now today, much of the things that we're purchasing that comes from innovation is coming from those third world countries that is inspired by first world countries. We are able to take it, purchase it at low cost, and commercialize it, scale it both overseas and back in the United States, interestingly. So this mobility does not just go one way, it comes back again. And if we're aware of this trend, of this opportunity to be able to take advantage of the innovation that not only comes from first world countries, but from third world countries, then we have a lot of opportunity that we have not.
Could I ask you for an example for that? That's
Sure.
very interesting.
I'll give a very simple automation example.
Yeah.
So traditionally, we purchased lasers in the United States. Lasers in the United States, a simple piece of equipment that changes the way people do things, were about $100,000. Mm-hmm. 2 years later, China comes out with its own model for about 15% of the cost, with 80% of the functionality. So we are able to scale a piece of equipment in China that allows us to then have laser farms, kind of like a server farm. Mm-hmm. 2 years later, China comes out with a piece of equipment that's manufactured for the local market that now has about 120% of the functionality for now about 9% of the original cost, that now allows us to bring back this equipment and machinery and pieces of automation and technology back to the United States and solve problems in a different way. Oh. Very interesting, and it allows us to innovate along the curve. Mm-hmm.
So when President Obama says, for instance, that we need to out-innovate our competitors or China, actually innovation elsewhere can be useful for us if it's used appropriately, or
absolutely. And the other side to it is our ability not only to have knowledge, but to apply our knowledge and commercialize our knowledge. We have a lot of parts, we have a lot of new nuts and bolts out there, but our ability to integrate it and then to commercialize it and bring it to market is what we have to push.
So, Mr. Bowe, so are we moving in the right direction?
Well, so the question, I'd say maybe we're moving a trend of increasing pessimism on this panel in terms of the answer to your question. That's a directional thing. I want to comment on both where we are and the direction. I think that we are moving in the wrong direction, and as Susie said, we are talking about things where other countries are doing stuff. You can look at the stimulus which we passed, which in fact we still haven't spent all the money on. Canada spent about 70% of that. No, I'm sorry, but say half on infrastructure, whereas in the U.S. it was less than 10%. The justification was infrastructure for long-term changes in the economy. In fact, it didn't get spent that way, and Canada's already resolved about 1/3 of their budget deficit related to that, where that we were arguing last month the $38 billion was 1% of our budget, 1% of our budget, and of that $38 billion, was it something like 6 was money that wasn't going to be spent anyway, like the Commerce Department money that was left over from the census. So I am highly concerned about our lack of success in dealing with these problems, which seem to be quite intransigent, and they're bipartisan, and both parties have contributed massively to a poor level of dialogue. We're not realistic about the extent of our problems and what's going to mean for the dollar, our ability to borrow money from China. It's got to be pretty scary if you're sitting there at as a business school graduate thinking, where is the U.S. going to be in a few years' time? I agree with something what Susie said, that innovation is occurring overseas, and we tend to think we are so great. We are good, but others are pretty darn good too. It worries me, when you do business around the world, it means I think of it every day while I'm sleeping. There's some people competing with me. Keeps me awake, frankly. But that's the way the world is. But in terms of the question is the trend. I think the trend is in the wrong direction. It doesn't mean it's inevitable that we will fail in solving our problems. When I was in business school, it was a known thing that Japan was going to overtake the U.S. Japan was buying up Fifth Avenue. They bought up golf courses. They bought up Hawaii. I remember going to a conference in 1985, an industry conference, and a guy from, it was either Mitsubishi or Mitsui, said to me, I cannot imagine that there is anything you would ever make that I would ever want to buy. I went home and said, whoa, I wrote that down. And the sad truth of the Japanese is 20 years later, they've been in 20 years of malaise and gone nowhere, and heavy government budget deficits, a lesson to us maybe. So the point is that these trends are not inevitable. They can change, and even if the 60% are right that we're going in the wrong direction, it doesn't mean it has to be that way. But we all have to wake up and beat people in Congress to head us in the right direction.
So head us in the right direction? What are some of the things you think the policymakers are not seeing or are not responding to with sufficient seriousness?
Well, just be specific about it. See, we're mostly from this part of the world, the region. Let's think of north towards Maryland. All three of us have businesses in Maryland. Our congressional delegation in Maryland does not know if it's for trade. It does not know that. I had a meeting with a congressman whom I respect who said, I'm not sure I'm for NAFTA. So what? We saw the dot here. Canada is our biggest trading partner and Mexico is number 2. And Canada is also the biggest trading partner of Maryland. I was kind of, whoa, if you're not for trade with Maryland, who are you for trade with? And so that the sense of fear that there's displacement, we got to get past that. And whether it's Democrat or Republican, they're both Democrats and Republicans against trade, and they both have to understand that that's looking backwards, and we can argue against it, and we'll be left behind by the Singapores and Indias and you name it.
You know, it's interesting. I'll follow up on what Peter said. Our company is one of the largest single exporters through the Port of Baltimore, Maryland. We export more than 30,000 tons of steel a year, all of it in containers, and that's a lot of those containers that you see on I-95. In my 20 years, I have never once had a state or any sort of official ever pay a visit to our company. I don't know if they don't know that we're on the radar screen or what. So it is the constituency for international trade. Sometimes we do feel a little bit like an island. And there's so many ways, and all of us who compete in the global markets can tell you, government, the right sort of government support to assist companies is absolutely essential. Like Peter's company, we also work with the U.S. Commercial Service, and they've given us some very tangible assistance in the last couple of years. Have really helped us out in some markets and done a lot of good work for us. We also use the Export-Import Bank of the United States, not for financing, but we do use them for credit insurance. They stepped into a very difficult situation for us as a result of the global financial crisis, when private credit insurers, due to losses, pulled back on their coverage in certain markets. We turned to the government, and they actually were very, very responsive on that front. But when I go to a trade show overseas, and I see what other governments do to support their companies, really, I commend what our government does for us sometimes in terms of direct assistance and trying to give advice, but we're on first base compared to certainly a lot of other developed countries.
So what, for instance, would be the kinds of things that you think some of the other countries are doing?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think it's a pretty deep thing that we have, for good reason. We have this view in this country that business and government, like a lot of other things, should be separate and distinct interests. So the U.S. Commercial Service works, and they work and cooperate with the State Department. But in many countries, it's Team Norway. I can tell you, it's Team Australia, it's Team Italy, and the assistance is very, very much more substantial than what we're used to doing it. Now, if you're a very large company, maybe you don't need some help from the government, but at the margin, a company like ours, where our direct competitors are sometimes hundreds of times the size of our company, any assistance is greatly appreciated.
Ms. Ganz, so do you find that government is doing for your company what you think it ought to be or could be doing?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have expectations for government, so I'm agnostic in that one, and agnostic is fine. But a couple of examples of what they could be doing. So as an example, during the Reagan administration, Reagan had decided that semiconductors were a strategic resource and decided to be able to create an industry cluster, a research center around this particular product, understanding that fundamentally whoever was producing semiconductors would have a competitive advantage for many years. I don't think that we have focused on which industries we'd like to cluster and compete in and focus on shared R&D resources that can proliferate new clusters of industries. I think that for our business, again, we're a small business, but what's remarkable to me is that we do not look at things like our tax code. So let me give you an example of how that impacts us. In Hong Kong, max tax is 17%. Here, I'm sure you're all familiar with whatever the max tax is. But the difference between 17% and the United States tax is the difference in incentivizing companies to bring their capital overseas and keep it overseas, because obviously if we repatriate it, we get taxed at the United States tax rate. And so we have two effects. One is the lack of income, because what's remarkable to me is at the end, I think we probably paid more tax last year than General Electric, right? Based upon their zero tax, right? Number one. And number two is the fact that those dollars that then go overseas generally remain overseas. So we are incentivizing the future investment strategies to be overseas. If we don't address these things, then all we're doing is continue our path of suggesting this is how we're going to operate in the future. And I realize it's complicated, it's complex. However, we have to take an approach of understanding our world in a new world order and be able to begin to address some of the things. Things like that would assist not only Lion, but I think would assist the United States.
So, well, to follow up on the New World Order, I think I want to leave enough time for questions. So I'll ask two questions. One is that as you think ahead to the next 5-10 years, how do you see the world? I mean, what is the world in your companies that you're thinking about or planning for or forecasting? Let's start with you.
Well, basically, we're a company that competes in a very volatile industry. It's tough for us to forecast beyond 90 days, even 6 months. So we tend to be like the chameleon. We tend to stay nimble, and we try to adjust as circumstances permit. Going out, looking over the next several years, I would have to say that probably for reasons that Susan and Peter alluded to, having to do perhaps with the budget deficit and the like, we would expect to remain in our business fairly competitive from the United States into global markets, primarily because of the declining value of the dollar relative to a whole basket of foreign currencies. That has been a major benefit for our company over the last 15 years, and we expect it will continue. Ironically, another continuing trend that's beneficial to us is the U.S. trade deficit. The volume of goods coming into this country, the disproportionate volume of goods coming to this country relative to what's being exported, means that for us as exporters, actually our transportation costs get more and more favorable, because basically it's either our cargo is going to go in those containers that are leaving the port of Baltimore, or they're going back to China empty. So we actually get very, very competitive rates. It actually, believe it or not, it costs us less today, even before the recent increase in fuel prices, costs us less to ship a container of steel to China than it is to transport the same quantity of steel to Pittsburgh. Believe it or not. Now, people find that very surprising, but it just goes to show how there's always a reverse side to trade flows, and U.S. companies in certain businesses can benefit from it.
So our industry is going to be a very interesting industry, and I'm thrilled about the opportunity to work in the industry in the next 10 years. Our industry, apparel and textiles, changes. So the role of our company is, about 5 years ago, we decided to focus on innovation and invention. And we're growing at a very fast clip as a result of that. But in that space, in that invention and innovation space, we focus on changing materials, integrating virtual and physical worlds. Apparel will change over the next 5 to 10 years from being a dumb terminal to essentially being a smart terminal. It's terrifying, by the way. I'm too old to augment with my environment. But the ability to be able to utilize these inventions, to be able to integrate these things is what we see coming down the pike. And for us, again, going from a world of mass production to a world of personalization in everything we do suggests that we're focused on how we participate in those worlds. So we know we'll be more global. We know we'll have to increase and accelerate our rate of invention and innovation. But I think it's a fun space to be playing in for the next decade.
Yeah. Let me give you a slight variation on that, which is, do you expect India, China, and others to play a larger role in your future at Ellicott, or how do you see the future vis-a-vis emerging markets?
Susie mentioned with respect to China earlier that there's some inflation there, cost price issues, and the currency adjustments. That's led to factories moving inland. There's actually some labor shortages, I think, for the first time ever, at least higher priced labor. So you see people who are totally driven by cost moving further and further inland, which creates all kinds of challenges for them. There are some tendencies to self-correct. So in terms of my thinking about the future, like I said, I'm somewhat avoiding China, but as a market to sell to. But I think that this is a hunch more than a bet that they will not be the competitive risk in our industry that some might think that they will be. I don't see the 10%. The technology factor, there's so much material component in what we make that I don't see the 10% laser cost strategy that she mentioned. But so building what Bill said, partly because of the dollar and partly because of the extent of labor in our product, we still are very much a US-made product. I see that continuing, though we will do co-manufacturing in certain markets as it makes sense for logistics or politics or things like that. As long as the world economy continues to grow, we're going to keep growing. I don't see one of the good things in our little market is a niche field and construction equipment. I don't see the Indians getting into it in too big a way. Interestingly, the Koreans did in the 80s and they got out of it. I should say that the Japanese did in the 70s, the Koreans in the 80s, and they said, this market is too nichey, doesn't suit our production economies of scale, so they got in and got out. I'm not saying China will do the same thing. I don't know about India. India's got all kinds of challenges itself in terms of transparency, rule of law, the things that will hold them back compared to our type of activity. As long as we can continue to be nimble and adapt and react and move quickly, I think we'll do fine, assuming the world economy does fine. No one here has mentioned the Middle East and all that's going on right now. It's pretty scary to think about what that means. We have projects going like every single country there right now, and actually none of them have been affected, which is interesting. That's not true. We had a contract canceled in Libya, a little one. But they have ports. They still need to move stuff in and out. So it just gets more complicated and more reasons not to sleep.
It's a last question from me before we turn it over to the audience. So we have a lot of MBA students in the audience, and they're planning for careers. With respect to planning for sort of the global arena in which you operate, what advice would you have for them? Starting with you, Mr. Hutton.
Well, first is fairly obvious. Living abroad, working abroad is tremendously valuable experience. But even if you don't have the opportunity to live abroad, any sort of international experience is vital. Our company, when we're looking to hire people, and we do hire young people who are interested in traveling, we wouldn't consider hiring anybody who hasn't had some sort of experience traveling or studying even abroad. That's definite. But the other piece of advice I would give is practical, and that is for students coming out. Don't shy away from looking for work experiences which are going to give you real hands-on exposure to the nitty-gritty of international trade. I mean, I can tell you something, whether it's myself or Susan or Peter, you wouldn't believe what we sometimes spend our time working on. I mean, succeeding in any business for most companies, especially small, medium, or even larger companies, is very, very hands-on. I can assure you the BlackBerry in my pocket here is stuffed with all kinds of mundane issues, whether we have a consignment where we have a problem with documents and we're about to incur demurrage overseas. Where's the euro this morning? 147, 147.8 yesterday. Where is it today? Am I going to cover some FX? Are we going to do this or that? I mean, and on and on and on. So in school, at least as I remember it, you do learn, a lot, and you're exposed to a lot of issues, particularly at the macro level, at the corporate strategic level, which is great. When you're looking for that first work experience, be sure to get actual hands-on, real-life experience at the ground level.
Right, and certainly concur in terms of taking an international assignment or international assignments, because it's not just about one space. It's about understanding it within a global framework and a global context. This morning I was with my 14-year-old watching Will and, it's true, watching Will and Kate. And she had lots of questions, but the questions were very cultural, Nate, and it was a great touch point. The thing that I would say as a follow-up is consider taking the dirtiest job. I don't know how many of you have watched the series on television, but there's something about the dirtiest job, the hardest job, the one that no one wants, which will give you the experience that gives you the leg up. And it's not about the sexiest job, the most glamorous job. It's the exact opposite. It's the one where you have to absolutely put your hands in, get dirty. You will come home exhausted, exhilarated, with a sense of understanding that few of your peers have. So I'd say take that risk. The last and third thing I'd say is continue your curiosity, because what you'll find is this is a world that's changing very rapidly. The impact of mobility everywhere is that your ability to tip your mind external and keep it tipped external as you're working internally is an area that creates tremendous value for both you and the entity as you continue your professional development.
Great advice. I want to start over again. I was an MBA 30 years ago, and I observed that from my business school, it was a very good correlation that the majority did the highest paid thing that year or the previous year, and 10 years later they were out of it. Whether it was, believe it or not, one time it was marketing, but there was consulting and investment banking and blah, 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 venture capital. And the folks that went into it for the money, then they got out of it because the money was good, but it wasn't satisfying, or it was just too hard. I mean, literally it ground people down. So I would encourage people to take a long-term view of things. Like all of us here actually on this panel are entrepreneurs, and maybe we started that way, maybe we didn't. But I think if you do get into the money, into a job for money, maybe you'll get out of it, or maybe you're not. You'll just get stuck with it. And I think if you think that you want to be an entrepreneur, you should do what Bill and Susie have said: to start in a different path from the beginning. Get into something to say, even if it doesn't mean you should be poor by being an entrepreneur. You're not in it because you usually are capitalistic. But the rewards may be lower financially in the short term, but they should be higher in the long term, and also more satisfying. So take that risk. Don't be governed by short-term money, and try to stay away from just, if everyone else is doing finance, so what?
Okay, I'll open it up for questions. Please speak into the microphone.
So a question to Mr. Peter Bowe. You said you're not in China because of intellectual property concerns. Do the concerns go down because you're not in China?
Do the concerns go down because I'm not there?
Yeah, right. Because, would you sell one of your equipment to a Chinese customer who could be a competitor?
Well, actually, my Dutch competitor is there, and it's a fuller story. Is that it's sort of like attacking at Omaha Beach. If you could avoid to go in, if there was a soft underbelly, you'd take it as opposed to going in head on. There's plenty of markets we can attack that can be profitable for us that we still aren't yet exploiting besides China. So why go after this big, hard, messy one when there's still other things that we aren't yet doing? I think it does minimize our risk not to be there. I actually don't understand, my Chinese competitor, who's a bigger company with a broader product line, let's say they make things like airplanes. It's not just to put the scale of complexity and size. They're suing one of their customers now who's copied a $50 million product. And they put it to me, said they copied everything, including the mistakes. And I have enough hassles in my life without worrying about that. And it's a big market for them, so I'm still okay with my strategy on this, and I think it does minimize my problems by not selling there. Again, if I don't turn customers down, but I don't chase it.
Clearly, if you were in China, given the nature of competition, it would be hard to make money. So that, and plus you have markets in other countries, so that's extremely sensible, it seems.
Correct.
The question I have is, because a company, and that could be Ellicott Dredges, it could be another company, that if you operate in China versus if you don't operate in China, does it make a difference to the intellectual property risks, whatever they may be, high or low?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question, or if I'm not answering it right.
Yeah, my question is just to clarify that you said, if you were operating in China, if you were selling in China, why would the intellectual property risks increase?
Well, because the Chinese are apt to reverse engineer a product.
But they can do that even if you don't sell in China.
Well, but they tend not to do it. I mean, it's less easy for them. I mean, I can only speak to my experience, and that hasn't happened as much. Now, there are plenty of reasons to the Chinese, in our, say, construction equipment, you can talk about the lifetime cost of ownership. Something may be cheaper in the beginning, but it doesn't last as long or work as efficiently. So it's not like a slam dunk that the Chinese are going to succeed in any particular market. But like I said, I will sell there if I have the chance, but if I look at my various choices, I'm just not spending effort on it. There are other places where I can spend my time. I mean, do I want a rep? Do I want an office? Do I want to go to trade shows? Do I want to spend travel time there and overhead there? That's the kind of choice that I'm making not to do.
This question is for Mr. William Hutton. With respect, you mentioned the importance of the relationship between government and small to medium-sized enterprises, or government and business. Would you give us a couple of examples of different ways that support system could help SMEs, and specifically how to improve that relationship?
I think I mentioned an example, and Peter has had similar experience. One area where government can potentially help small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly develop overseas markets, is through market research, is through facilitating country visits, through searching for overseas partners, whether those be reps for products, whether those be actual customers for products, anything which can leverage time and dollars for a small, medium-sized enterprise is very, very helpful. That's a very concrete example. The other example that I mentioned has to do with financial assistance. We didn't talk about, Peter mentioned OPIC briefly. There's OPIC, but also, as I alluded to, there is assistance available for U.S. origin product, financing of sales of U.S. origin product, and also guaranteeing payment for those sales of U.S. origin product. The Export-Import Bank, as a result of the President's Export Initiative, has been much more proactive in trying to beef up their support for U.S. exports, and that's a very tangible benefit because, again, as I said, This, I know sometimes in this country we get nervous. Ooh, this is state support of industry. But to be perfectly honest with you, every single major trading partner of the United States does exactly these things, and they actually are doing it on a bigger scale relatively, and they've been doing it in many cases as long or even longer than we have. So it really does help.
Thank you. Hello, this is Jorge Urruti. I got a question for Susan. You mentioned your strategy of bringing back your production from China and Central America to the U.S. I sort of understand the idea of bringing it to Central America, but I don't quite understand why would you bring it back from Central America to the U.S., and how are you going to keep the, economically, how are you going to be able to keep your profits by manufacturing in the U.S. as opposed to a country where labor is so much cheaper?
Sure. It's simple. It's by changing the labor component of what we produce. So by focusing on advanced automation, and again, where those automations become affordable, that it then drives the ability. Essentially, we ended up swapping out, U.S. jobs today for freight, right, and low-cost labor. As low-cost labor begins to increase, which it will continue to do, and the cost of freight continues to increase, which it will, and the cost of automation and other labor-saving devices decreases, we begin to have a change in terms of those rates and what it means. So that we're a little bit advanced today, but for high-value products, it makes sense in the United States. Our objective is to drive that further.
Question? Yeah.
Okay, I have a comment and a question. Susie, you spoke about during the Reagan administration that they thought that semiconductors were a strategic thing, and so that kind of impacted a bunch of things. And if I remember correctly, a lot of American companies started manufacturing in Taiwan, and then of course that ended up in China, and so we do a lot of semiconductor manufacturing outside the country. And there, you can always sell it to Japan, and there's not the same. The recent news I mentioned in my opening remarks about India now, that the U.S. companies are no longer in the final round for choosing the $10 billion fighter jet thing, because, and I asked people, why did that happen? Because if you remember, Obama was there, and there was all this big push to get the Indians to buy fighter jets from the United States. And the answer was that the fighter jet could become a strategic good. In other words, you could buy the fighter jets, but then if something happens out there in geopolitical stuff, that the spare parts for those fighter jets may not be available. So they were more willing to, the risk of dealing with the Europeans was much less than the risk of dealing with the United States. So I'm just wondering, looking forward, I mean, how does the U.S. geopolitical interests and activities affect perhaps your industries, steel, for example, but also what is your view on what could happen moving forward? And rather than the government being a support, perhaps the government is a hindrance to some extent. So I just would like to get a sense of your comments on your specific industries, and perhaps even a general response to how the U.S. geopolitical interest affects international dealings with these emerging economies.
Well, for our business, I'll just speak to the steel business and our product. We are in certain respects a commodity business, and our margins are tight. And therefore, where we have greatest concern about U.S. geopolitical standing, and who we're in favor with, who we're not in favor, really comes back to trade policy. Trade policy. I mean, it's a generalization, but it really is true. An open trading system is the oxygen that allows our company to breathe. And I'm not talking about the difference between a 40% tariff rate overseas and 0. I'm talking about the difference between 15% and 8% can be the difference in terms of whether we're competitive in an overseas market or not. So I think I would answer the question, sum it up by saying that for our company, when we think about geopolitical changes, maybe a shift in the relative U.S. influence globally versus other major trading blocs or other individual countries, our concern over the future probably rests more squarely in the area of trade policy than anywhere else.
Can I jump in on that a little bit? Mm-hmm. Bill talked about Team Australia and Team whatever. That certainly is true. I was shocked and pleased when President Obama in his recent trip to India actually had some trade agenda. It helped us get one of our deals. It's a couple $1 million deal for the in Mumbai, and I'm not sure it would have happened without his push. And did he do anything? His staff did it, but that's fine. It had exactly what the Team Australia kind of concept was, and it shows the real power of that. It does go both ways. You say the geopolitical stuff. If you read, as I'm sure you do, The Economist or even the Financial Times, you talk about what's going on with China and the backlash against the U.S. for various things. And it happens time and again. There are people in Pakistan saying, don't buy from the U.S., or people saying that the U.S. is moralistic about its approach. We lost a deal in the 70s to Finland because of the U.S. involvement over the after Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and we had an embargo against the Soviet Union. Well, we were actually about to get a deal that we got written out of because of there was a specific attempt by the Soviets and their allies to stop buying American. It made a difference. So one of the challenges we have is that our goal of diplomacy is world peace. We're the world's policeman. No one else is. So because we're the world's policeman, sometimes we beat people on the head and they don't like it, or their friends don't like it. Canada's not going to do that. Britain's not going to do it. France isn't going to do it. We're the only people that will do it. I'm not saying we should or we shouldn't, but to the extent that we do it, there will be commercial repercussions. So it's hard to have a straight keel about that, but it involves our administrations of either party being more reluctant to use even commercial weapons. So you're talking about access to spare parts. We're forced and we're go right in the forefront. We'll withhold stuff. Other countries don't do that. Now we have to balance these trade and things. No one mentioned visas. To get to the U.S. is a hard thing for a lot of people. You have to fly to different cities to get go through a very unpleasant application, and then pay a lot of money. It's not easy. So we have our own agendas, and it does get in the way of trade.
And lastly, I'd suggest that we don't operate in a style of collaboration. We're not comfortable in a style of collaboration yet. And it may be the next generation that takes us to the style of collaboration. When we're used to having vendors, we're not really used to having true collaborators, whether it be in research or whether it be in commercialization. And this is something that we're going to have to grapple with when you have to influence others and work with others, but not necessarily command and control others. And I think that this is going to be one of our key challenges in how we develop global networks.
Okay, one last question from there, and then we'll break for coffee.
My question is for Susan. You talked a little bit about the need for sort of tax incentives for keeping business in the United States. At the same time, especially in light of recent reports about GE, there's been sort of a public outcry in how little taxes that corporate America is paying, especially in the face of the budget crisis and sort of the need for more serious taxes on these businesses to sort of play their part in holding up the United States government. And I was wondering how you think that the government should go about addressing sort of these tax issues in terms of getting business back into the United States at the same time as appeasing sort of the public opinion that the businesses should be pulling their weight.
So you have countries that are acknowledging that this shift in taxes makes a fundamental difference in terms of people's desire and ability to pay taxes. It's kind of like Freakonomics. What's the natural law? How low will you go that incentivizes you to pay your taxes? And how simple is that? And how easy is it? Versus all of the dollars going offshore and the inability to repatriate. So I think that it's very, very difficult, highly comprehensive in a time when there's never been more complexity. So a very, very difficult thing to do, but in terms of getting the United States going, probably one of the top few things that we could do to have the dollars to spend here.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. We're deeply grateful to have you here.